Weimar was cold. Its streets were drowning in the November gloom, where the streetlights cast long shadows like fingers clinging to the pavement. The Etterna art gallery towered over the city, its glass walls catching the light. But inside there was a strange darkness, as if the light was afraid to linger. In the basement of the gallery, where the air was saturated with the smell of paint and dampness, Kaspar Wolf was finishing another portrait. His brush trembled, his eyes glowed with emptiness, and his movements were sharp, like those of a man possessed by an invisible rhythm. Lena Koch, the curator, stood in the doorway, watching him apply brushstrokes to the canvas, where the face of a young woman was emerging. Anna, the model, whose smile now seemed too fragile to Lena. Kaspar did not notice her presence. His fingers, stained with red, glided over the canvas as if he were not painting, but cutting. Lena could feel the cold of the basement, despite the warm wool of her coat. She had organized the Kaspar Wolf exhibition, believing that his return after a decade of silence would be a triumph for Etterna. His old works, full of dark symbolism, had once been called the new Bosch. But now there was something different about them. Not art, but a threat. Kaspar looked up, his lips twitching in a smile, but his eyes were dead. Lena turned away, her gaze falling on the old mirror in the corner, where her reflection seemed alien to her. The eyes were too dark, like those of her brother, who had died years ago. She blinked, and the mirror became just a mirror, but the feeling of being watched did not go away. That same day, Thomas Richter, the gallery's restorer, was working in the storage room where Kaspar's paintings were stored until the exhibition opened. His hands, accustomed to the delicate handling of canvases, froze when he noticed that one of the paintings, a landscape with black trees, was oozing red liquid from under its frame. Thomas ran his finger over the stain, expecting to smell paint, but the smell was metallic, almost alive. He recoiled, his heart pounding. The storage room was silent except for the hum of the ventilation system, but it seemed to Thomas that the trees on the canvas moved, their branches curling like claws. He examined the painting more closely and the stain was gone, leaving only a dry surface. Thomas wiped his hands, putting it down to fatigue, but deep down, he knew he had seen something else. He decided to tell Lena, but when he found her in the main hall, he saw her standing motionless in front of Anna's portrait, her face pale, as if she was looking not at the painting, but into emptiness. The opening of the exhibition brought together the elite of Weimar, collectors in formal suits, critics with notebooks, local patrons whose smiles hid their boredom. The halls of the Eterna filled with the hum of voices, the clink of glasses, and the rustle of footsteps on the marble floor. Kaspar's paintings hung on the walls, their colors bright but disturbing, as if they had absorbed the light. Portraits of people whose eyes seemed too alive, landscapes with shadows that moved in the corner of the eye, still lifes where flowers withered right on the canvas. Lena walked among the guests, her smile strained, her thoughts confused. She noticed that Anna, whose portrait occupied the central place, had not come, although she had promised. Lena tried to concentrate on the conversations, but her gaze returned to the portrait, where Anna's face now seemed not just painted but breathing. At one point it seemed to her that Anna blinked, but the light from the chandelier flickered, and the illusion disappeared. Thomas stood back, his hands still shaking from the morning's opening. He watched Kaspar move among the guests, his smile charming, but his movements jerky, like a puppet. Thomas approached Lena, intending to tell her about the painting, but her eyes were blank, as if she were listening to a voice he could not hear. He retreated, deciding to return to the basement after closing time to check on the other canvases. As the guests began to leave, Lena remained in the main hall, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her scarf. She looked at Anna's portrait again, and for a moment the face in the canvas was her brother's, his eyes reproachful and staring straight at her. Lena drew back, her breath catching, but the portrait was the same, only Anna's smile seemed wider. That same night, the police found Anna dead in her apartment a few blocks from the gallery. Her body was lying on the floor, covered in red paint that had spread like blood. Her eyes were open, their gaze an exact copy of the portrait in Etterna. The police called it suicide, but in Weimar, no one believed in simple explanations. Lena learned of the death in the morning, her hands shaking as she remembered the portrait. She went to the gallery to check it out and noticed that the colors were brighter, and Anna's face now had a calm that had not been there at the opening. Lena felt a coldness tightening in her chest, but she could not look away. Thomas, back in the basement, found a sketch hidden under an old canvas. It was of Lena and himself, their faces unfinished, but their eyes already seemed alive. He felt the air in the basement grow thick, as if someone was breathing down his neck. The mirror in the corner reflected his face, but for a split second it was not his. His lips moved, although he was silent. Thomas ran out of the basement, his heart pounding, but he knew he couldn't just leave. Kaspar, his paintings, the gallery, it was all part of something bigger that he didn't understand yet. Lena, standing in front of Anna's portrait, felt the same way, but her thoughts were confused, as if someone was painting them on the canvas, stroke by stroke. In the early morning, Weimar was drowning in a milky shroud of fog that clung to the spires and dissolved the outlines of the houses. The Etterna art gallery was silent but not peaceful. It was thick, like the breath of a sleeping animal. Lena Koch sat on the floor of the main hall, her back pressed against the cold wall, her eyes glued to the portrait of Anna. Less than a day had passed since the girl's death, but the picture had changed. The colors had become deeper, and Anna's face, once fragile, now radiated a strange peace, almost mockery. Lena had not slept all night, her thoughts tangled like threads that someone was tearing and sewing back together. She saw her brother in this portrait, his reproachful eyes flickering in every gleam of light. She tried to convince herself that it was fatigue, but the cold in her chest said otherwise. Thomas Richter had not been to the gallery since the opening. His hands still remembered the smell of the red liquid that had oozed from Kaspar Wolf's landscape. He had locked himself in his small apartment, where the smell of old books and paint thinner drowned out his anxiety. On the table lay the sketch he had found in the basement, his and Lena's faces drawn with frightening precision. Thomas looked at it, feeling the air in the room grow heavy, as if someone were sucking it out. He noticed that the lines in the sketch, especially around Lena's eyes, were sharper, even though he had not touched the paper. The mirror in the bathroom reflected his face, but the shadows under his eyes seemed deeper than they should have been, and for a moment he thought he saw them move. Life in the gallery went on, as if nothing had happened. Kaspar Wolf appeared in the main room around midday, his coat covered in mist, his smile a mask covering the emptiness. He did not speak of Anna's death, but his presence filled the space with a strange energy that made the gallery staff's hands tremble. Lena watched him from a distance, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her scarf as she tried to gather her thoughts. Kaspar walked up to Anna's portrait, his brush sliding across the canvas as if he were adjusting something, but Lena could not see the brush strokes. She wanted to ask him what he was doing, but her voice caught in her throat as if someone were squeezing her lungs. Kaspar turned to her, his eyes empty, but the corners of his lips twitched. Lena turned away, her gaze falling on the mirror in the corner of the room, where her reflection seemed older to her, with wrinkles she did not remember. Thomas, despite his fear, returned to the gallery in the evening. He could not leave Lena alone, although her obsession with the portrait of Anna frightened him as much as the sketch. In the storage room, he began to examine Kaspar's other works, his hands moving carefully as if the canvases might bite. In one of the portraits of an older man, he noticed that the paint had become brighter and the man's eyes were now looking straight at him, where before they had been looking away. Thomas recoiled, his flashlight flickering, and in the darkness of the storage room, he thought he heard a rustling sound, as if someone had passed behind him. He found an old box hidden under a shelf containing the sketches, dozens of faces, unfamiliar but with dates stretching back years. Some of the names matched missing persons whose cases the Weimar police had closed as suicides. Thomas felt a cold tightening in his chest, but he took a few of the sketches, deciding to show them to Lena. Lena, meanwhile, wandered through the halls, her steps slow, as if she were afraid to wake something sleeping in the walls. She stopped at a still life of flowers whose petals seemed wilted, although they had been fresh in the morning. Her dreams, which had begun after the opening, had become denser. Voices she did not recognize whispered her name, and the paintings in these dreams moved, their figures reaching out to her. She tried to attribute it to stress, to the guilt over her brother, whose death still lived in her, but the voices were too real. In one of the halls, she noticed Kaspar standing in front of a new portrait, the critic who had praised his work. At the opening, the portrait was unfinished, but the critic's eyes already seemed alive, their gaze heavy as stone. Lena wanted to leave, but her legs did not obey her, and she stood until Kaspar disappeared into the shadows. That same night, the critic whose portrait Kaspar was finishing was found dead in his home. His hands were covered in red paint, and on the floor lay a brush with which he had apparently been trying to paint something before he died. The police again spoke of suicide, but rumors in Weimar grew like mold. Lena learned of the death in the morning, her fingers trembling as she remembered the portrait. She went to the gallery to check on it, and noticed that the critic's face now had an oddly peaceful expression, and the colors were so bright that they seemed wet. She felt her dreams returning. The voices whispered louder, and in the mirror of the hall her reflection showed her brother's face for a moment. His lips moved, but there was no sound. Thomas, back in the basement, decided to check out Kaspar's studio. He snuck in when the gallery was empty, his flashlight illuminating paint cans, brushes, and dusty canvases. In the corner, he found glass jars filled with a dark liquid that smelled like blood, even though the labels said scarlet pigment. His hands shook when he noticed that one of the jars was labeled with Anna's name. Thomas stepped back, his gaze falling on the mirror where his reflection was not his own. His face was pale, with blood trickling from his eyes. He blinked, and the mirror returned to normal, but the fear remained. He took one of the jars, deciding that it was proof, although he didn't know who to show it to. Lena, back home, couldn't shake the feeling that the portraits were watching her. She stood in front of the mirror in her apartment. Her reflection was hers, but the shadows under her eyes seemed alive, as if someone was painting them right now. She remembered Kaspar's words about living inside the canvas, and felt her memories of her brother growing brighter but distorted, as if someone was rewriting them. Thomas, clutching the jar of blood, walked toward her house, his steps heavy, as if Weimar was trying to stop him. He knew that he and Lena were caught up in something that couldn't be explained, but he couldn't turn back. The gallery, her paintings, Kaspar, all of it was part of a nightmare that was just beginning. Weimar slept under the weight of the fog, its streets dissolved in a grey haze where sounds were muffled as if in cotton wool. The Etterna art gallery stood in this silence, its glass walls reflecting the emptiness. But inside, in the labyrinth of rooms, the darkness seemed alive. Lena Koch wandered through the gallery in the pre-dawn hour, her footsteps the only sound, breaking the gloom. She could not explain why she had returned here after the death of the critic, whose portrait of Kaspar Wolf now shone in the main hall, his eyes following her every move. Lena felt that the paintings knew her guilt for her brother, whose face flickered across every canvas like a ghost she could not banish. Her fingers trembled when she touched the walls, as if they could tell her what was happening. Thomas Richter had not slept for 3 nights. The jar of dark liquid he had found in Kaspar's basement sat on his desk, its scent permeating his dreams, where paintings came to life and their figures whispered his name. He tried to convince himself it was paint, but the metallic taste in his mouth said otherwise. Thomas looked in the mirror of his apartment, and his reflection frightened him. It was his, but the shadows under his eyes moved like ink spreading through water. He knew he had to go back to the gallery, check the basement, find something that would stop this nightmare. But fear held him like chains, and every step toward Etterna was a step into a darkness that grew thicker. In the gallery, Lena paused, in front of the portrait of Anna, whose face now seemed not just alive but mocking. She remembered Kaspar looking at that canvas, his fingers covered in red, trembling as if he were stroking not paint, but skin. Lena felt her own memories of her brother becoming alien, as if someone had cut them out of her mind and transferred them to the canvas. She wanted to leave, but her legs would not obey her, and she stood until the darkness of the hall began to move in the corner of her vision. The mirror in the corner reflected her face, but the eyes were not hers. They were her brother's eyes, full of pain, which she had seen on the day of his death. Lena turned away, her breath hitched, but the reflection remained, his lips moving, forming a word she did not hear. Thomas slipped into the gallery through the service entrance, his torch shaking in his hand as he illuminated the narrow hallway that led to the basement. He hadn't told Lena he was coming here, afraid that her obsession with the portraits would make her untrustworthy. The basement smelled of paint and damp, but now there was something heavy, almost alive, mixed in with it. Thomas noticed that the paint cans he had seen earlier had been moved, and one of them now had his name written on it in a shaky hand. He opened it, and the smell of blood filled his nostrils, causing him to retreat. His torch fell, the beam of light slid across a mirror in the corner, and Thomas froze. His reflection stood still even as he moved, blood streaming from his eyes. He blinked, and the mirror went blank, but the fear remained, a stain that wouldn't come off. Lena, unaware of Thomas's presence, went down to the basement, driven by an impulse she couldn't explain. She found Kaspar's journal hidden beneath a pile of canvases, its pages covered with notes about the souls that live in the paint. He wrote that the blood of the victim bound her to the canvas, and her gaze completed the ritual, allowing the soul to remain in the painting. Lena read, her fingers shaking, and every word felt true, even though her mind screamed at her that it was nonsense. She remembered the way Kaspar had looked at her, his eyes empty but full of knowledge, as if he could see her guilt for her brother, her fear, her weakness. The journal fell from her hands when she heard a rustling behind her, but it was only Thomas, his face as pale as the canvas. They didn't speak. Their eyes met in the darkness, and each knew the other had seen the same thing. Thomas showed her the jar with his name on it, Lena showed her the diary, and the darkness of the basement grew thicker, as if the walls were closing in. They found another portrait, hidden behind a mirror, a gallery assistant, a young man who had helped with the lighting. His eyes on the canvas were unfinished, but they already seemed alive, their gaze heavy as a grave. Lena and Thomas knew he was doomed, but they didn't know how to save him. They left the basement, their steps quick, but the darkness followed them like a shadow that couldn't be shaken off. The next day, the assistant was found dead, his body at the foot of the gallery stairs, his face covered in red paint, his hands clutching a shard of mirror. The Weimar police called it an accident, but rumors grew like cracks in glass. Lena returned to the gallery, her eyes as empty as the portraits, and her dreams grew thicker, the voices in them whispering her name, calling her to the canvas. She stood before the portrait of the assistant, whose face now expressed a peace that was missing in life. Thomas, clutching the sketches found in the basement, looked at her from afar, his fingers trembling, but he knew they could not simply go away. Kaspar was somewhere nearby, his shadow falling on the walls, and the painting seemed to breathe, waiting for new brushstrokes. Weimar was plunged into cold darkness, its streets cut out of old canvas where the colors had faded to gray shadows. The Etterna art gallery stood in the center of this emptiness, its glass walls reflecting the stars. But inside there was a haze as thick and sticky as paint, mixed with blood. Lena Koch sat in the basement, her fingers clutching the edge of an old chair, while in front of her Kaspar Wolf was brushing his brush across the canvas where her own face was visible. His brush moved with feverish precision, his eyes were empty, and the air was thick with the smell of paint and something metallic that Lena tried not to notice. She had agreed to pose without understanding why, but her mind, tormented by dreams and visions of her brother, obeyed Kaspar, as if he held the brush not only over the canvas but over her soul. Thomas Richter, locked in a cellar closet, felt the walls closing in around him. Kaspar had lured him there on the pretext of checking old frames, but the door had slammed shut and the key had turned in the lock. Thomas pounded on the wood until his palms ached, but the cellar absorbed the sounds like a black hole. His flashlight lay on the floor, its beam falling on an old painting hidden under a cloth. Thomas tore off the cover and froze. On the canvas was Lena's brother, his face full of pain, staring right at him. The paint was fresh, as if it had been painted yesterday. But Thomas knew that Lena's brother had died years ago. He felt a chill run through him, not from the dampness, but from the knowledge that Kaspar knew their past, their weaknesses, their fear. Lena sat still, her gaze fixed on the canvas where her portrait was taking shape. Kaspar did not speak, his breathing heavy, almost animal-like, and his fingers, coated in red, left marks on the frame. Lena felt her memories of her brother coming to life, but they were distorted, as if someone were rewriting them. She had seen his face in her dreams, but now he stood behind Kaspar, his eyes empty, his hands reaching out to her. Lena blinked, and the vision disappeared, but her heart was pounding as if she had been running. She noticed the cup of tea Kaspar had placed next to her, its surface covered in an oily film. Lena did not drink, but her thoughts were confused, as if the tea was not the only thing poisoning her. The portrait on the canvas was growing brighter, her eyes in it already seemed alive, and her smile was alien, like Anna's, like a critic's, like an assistant's. Thomas was in the storeroom, searching for a way out. His hands groped along the walls until they found an old ventilation grate. He ripped it off, ignoring the pain in his fingers, and squeezed into a narrow passage that smelled of mold and paint. Crawling was difficult. The air was heavy, but Thomas knew Lena was in danger. He suspected that Kaspar was putting something in her tea. Her obsession with portraits, her empty stare, was more than just fear. The passage led him into the studio, where Lena sat before Kaspar, her face as pale as a canvas. Thomas froze when he saw the portrait. Lena's eyes in the painting followed him, even as she stared into space. He noticed the paint cans labeled with their names, and realized that Kaspar wasn't just painting. He was stealing them, stroke by stroke. Kaspar sensed Thomas's presence, his head turning like a predator scenting prey. He took a step toward him, his fingers clutching his hand. Like a weapon, Thomas lunged forward, trying to pull Lena away, but Kaspar was faster. He hit Thomas across the head and he fell, blood running into his eyes. Lena, roused from her stupor, screamed, but her voice was weak, as if the cellar was swallowing her. She grabbed a cup of tea and threw it at Kaspar, the liquid splashing on his face, and he hissed, stepping back. Lena helped Thomas to his feet, her hands shaking, but she knew there was no time. They ran from the studio, leaving Lena's portrait unfinished, his eyes shining in the darkness like stars. On the street, Weimar greeted them with cold and silence. Lena and Thomas ran, their steps lost in the fog, but the feeling that Kaspar was following them did not go away. Lena returned home. Her apartment was cold, and the mirror in the hallway reflected her face, but the smile was not hers. It was the one that remained on the canvas. She turned away, her fingers clutching her scarf as she tried to remember who she was. Thomas, his head bandaged, sat in his apartment, looking at the sketch he had taken from the basement. In it, their faces were almost finished, and he knew that Kaspar would not stop. He remembered the painting of Lena's brother, its fresh paint, and realized that Kaspar was connected to their past, but how remained a mystery. In the gallery that night, Kaspar stood before Lena's portrait, his fingers stroking the canvas, where her eyes were already breathing. He did not speak, but his lips moved as if he were whispering to the painting. The portrait was unfinished, but the paint flowed like blood, and the darkness of the cellar seemed to answer him. Lena, lying in her bed, dreamed of her brother calling her to the canvas, his voice soft but full of reproach. Thomas, looking in the mirror, noticed that his reflection lingered. His eyes were not his own, but someone else's. Weimar slept, but the gallery did not sleep. Its paintings waited, and the darkness around them grew thicker like paint, ready to swallow everything. Weimar was suffocating in the pre-dawn darkness, its streets drowning in a fog that seemed not just moisture, but the breath of a city guarding its secrets. The Eterna art gallery stood like a wound on Weimar's body, its glass walls reflecting the emptiness. But inside, in the labyrinth of halls and basements, the darkness moved like a living being. Lena Koch and Thomas Richter made their way to the gallery, their steps heavy, as if the city was trying to hold them back. Lena clutched a lighter, her fingers trembling from cold and fear, and her eyes reflected determination mixed with pain. Thomas, with a bandage on his head where blood was still oozing from a wound, carried a canister of solvent, his face pale but firm. They knew that Kaspar Wolf was waiting for them, that his paintings were not just canvases, but traps that had already stolen Anna, the critic, the assistant, and perhaps a part of themselves. They were going to burn everything, but the darkness around them was thicker than they could have imagined. The gallery's basement greeted them with the smell of paint and blood and dampness that seeped into their lungs like poison. Lena led the way, her torch flickering as it illuminated jars of dark liquid, canvases covered in dust, and a mirror, whose glass seemed alive, pulsing in time with their hearts. She felt her memories of her brother, whose face flickered in every portrait, growing sharper, but they were not hers now. They belonged to Kaspar, to his brush, to his madness. Thomas followed, his gaze riveted on the unfinished portrait of Lena they had left behind last time. The eyes in the canvas were shining, their gaze not just alive but hungry, as if they were waiting for the final brushstroke. He noticed his own reflection lingering in the mirror, his lips moving even though he was silent. And Thomas turned away, feeling the cold tightening in his chest. They began to pour solvent into the cellar. Their movements were fast, but the darkness resisted as if the walls were breathing. Lena stopped at the portrait of her brother that Thomas had found in the storeroom. His face was so real that she could almost hear his voice calling to her. She wanted to touch the canvas, but Thomas grabbed her hand. His fingers were cold as ice. They did not speak, but their looks said everything. If they did not destroy the paintings, Kaspar would complete their portraits, and they would disappear, like Anna, like the others. Lena poured solvent on the portrait of her brother. Her hands trembled and tears burned her eyes, but she did not stop. The darkness of the cellar became thicker, the air trembled as before a storm, and they heard footsteps, slow, heavy, as if someone was carrying the whole of Weimar on their shoulders. Kaspar emerged from the shadows, his figure distorted like a reflection in a broken mirror. His face was pale, his eyes blazing with emptiness, and his hands, covered in red paint, clutched his brush like a weapon. He did not speak, but his lips moved, whispering to the canvases, which seemed to respond to him. Lena lit a match, its flame weak but as strong as her will. Kaspar stepped toward her, his shadow falling across Lena's portrait, and the eyes on the canvas blinked, their gaze full of pain. Thomas lunged at Kaspar, his fist hitting the artist's face, but he did not fall. He stood as if the darkness held him. Kaspar struck back, his brush slamming into Thomas's shoulder, and blood mixed with the paint that spread across the floor. Lena threw the match, and the fire flared up, devouring the canvases, the jars, the sketches, everything Kaspar had created. The flames roared like a beast, but they were not ordinary flames. They writhed as if alive, clinging to the portraits that seemed to scream. Lena saw her brother's face writhing on the canvas, his eyes looking at her, full of reproach, but she did not turn away. Thomas pulled Kaspar away from the fire, but the artist broke free, his scream inhuman, as if he were burning along with the paintings. He rushed to Lena's portrait, his hands caressing the canvas until the flames engulfed it. Kaspar disappeared in the smoke, his figure dissolving like a shadow. But Lena and Thomas knew that he was not dead. He had become part of the darkness that lived in the gallery. They ran out of the basement, the fire chasing them, its heat burning their skin. But they did not stop until they were on the street, where Weimar greeted them with cold and silence. The gallery was burning, its glass walls cracking like bones, and the smoke rising to the sky like a soul finally freed. Lena and Thomas stood on the pavement, their faces blackened with soot, their eyes empty. They did not speak, but their eyes met, and there was no victory in them, only bitterness. They had destroyed the paintings, but something remained in their dreams, in their reflections, in their memories. Lena returned home. Her apartment was cold, and the mirror in the hallway reflected her face. But the shadows under her eyes were deeper than before, and for a moment she thought they moved. She turned away, her fingers clutching her scarf, but her brother's voice calling her still sounded in her head, soft but full of reproach. Thomas, sitting in his apartment, looked at the sketch he had rescued from the basement. His and Lena's faces, now burned but still vivid in his memory. He noticed that his reflection in the mirror lingered. His eyes were not his but someone else's, and he knew that Kaspar had not left. The gallery was closed, its ashes blown away by the wind, and Weimar was silent, as if nothing had happened. The police had not found Kaspar. His body had vanished like smoke, and rumors about him grew like cracks in an old canvas. Lena and Thomas tried to move on with their lives, but every time they passed the mirror, they felt that a part of them remained in Etterna, in those portraits that had burned but not died. Weimar slept. Its streets were drowning in fog. But somewhere, in the shadows, Kaspar's paintings still existed, not in a gallery, but in the memories of those who had seen them. They waited, their colors ready to accept new brush strokes, new souls. Lena and Thomas knew this, but they could not change anything. The darkness they saw was not only in Kaspar, but in themselves, and its bitter taste remained forever.